Welcome to Cannabis 360, your source for cannabis and psychedelic industry news, interviews, and insights. Visit canna360.ca and sign up to receive free access to the entire Cannabis 360 catalog. Making the transition from the legacy market to the regulated cannabis industry can be a huge challenge for companies as well as their employees. However, leveraging the decades of experience that have been gained pre-legalization can provide a massive advantage for cannabis companies. In this episode of High Fidelity, we speak with Velvet Kavanagh, founder of Phenologic. With decades of business ownership, management, and agricultural experience, and over 5 years as a ground-level cannabis contractor, Velvet works with companies to improve their cannabis operations, navigate a heavily regulated environment, and increase profits. We discuss how companies can fine-tune their operations after each harvest, avoid some common mistakes, and what the industry can learn from legacy operators. Well, hi, Velvet. How are you today?
Hi, Connor. I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you join us today. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how to leverage legacy knowledge and people in the cannabis industry. So let's just start off with some basics, though. I think sort of an ongoing debate that we're hearing a lot about in the cannabis industry, especially if you're on LinkedIn, is sort of this debate between whether cannabis is a CPG or an agricultural crop, right? And I think a lot of things, it's probably the answer is it's a combination of the two. But let's start off with the fact that cannabis is a plant, it is an agricultural crop, and sort of what do you think are the challenges that tends to pose for operators that are entering the industry?
I like this question, and I kind of take it in a couple different ways. So one way is the operator's understanding of agriculture, and then there's the regulatory challenges in dealing with agriculture. So first, from the operator standpoint, there's a lot of people coming into the industry from a pharmaceutical background, which is used to operating in a very sterile, highly controlled situation. We also have people coming in from financial, from tech, real estate, and like you mentioned, consumer packaged goods, CPG. People coming in from these industries that maybe just don't really understand plants and agriculture. A way that I like to put it is plants are going to plant. They're going to do what they want. The best that we can do is be a steward and guide them to do what we want them to do. They're a living creature. They have their own agenda, and we really need to respect that and work with plants. Particularly when plants are being grown in an indoor environment, we're really pushing them to their genetic maximum. So you want to create the kind of environment that is going to allow them to do what it is that you want them to do. The other piece of that is the regulations and how regulations coming from Health Canada may not have a full understanding of plant biology, farming, and cannabis. For example, microbials. This is a common topic with people about doing lab tests and what the results are with the microbials. Microbes are on everything, and they're not all bad. Some of them are neutral, some of them are beneficial. Plants, like I say, they're alive, they're not sterile, so there's going to be microbials in there. Farming, plants have cycles, there's natural interactions in between microbials, soil, inputs, other plants, insects, the environment. Again, we can try and control this, but really we can only guide it towards the result that we want. And then cannabis, with the regulations, some of the regulations to longtime growers, they just don't really make a lot of sense. People are required to track things like plant parts like stalks or root mass that really pose no or very little security or public health risk, but we're still required to track them. And those pieces really are good for compost, and the weight can change if the moisture level changes. So these types of things, putting farming and agriculture into the particular regulatory set that we have right now, can pose a lot of challenges for people.
So it could be a transition, right? Getting into that sort of hyper regulated world, and sort of like you said, sort of you can't be in control of everything, right? And so you want to do it as much as you can, but at the end of the day, like you said, plants are going to plant, right? So and now in terms of like that conversation specifically around like, is cannabis a consumer packaged good? Like, what are sort of like your feelings about that? Is it something that you think we're sort of moving in that direction? We're just not quite there yet. Will it like sort of never neatly fall into that box? Just kind of curious on your thoughts on whether cannabis is a CPG or not.
Yes, we're moving in that direction, but if you think about it, no other CPG product has gone through 95 years of prohibition, has an incredible cultural stigma, or has been the subject of decades of anti-drug propaganda. This creates a really unique situation. Canned soup has never had to deal with that. We're really undergoing a big societal shift about cannabis as a plant and what's legal and what's socially acceptable. In a cannabis rich area like where I live in the Kootenays in BC, cannabis is very socially acceptable. In other areas though, with different demographics, not so much. For example, I was in Ontario last week and I was speaking with a woman in her 70s about cannabis. She was having some sore back, and we were talking about maybe some ways that cannabis could help with that. And she didn't want to go into a cannabis store because what would people think? So we're dealing with that. That's an issue. Dishwasher soap, flats of beer, they don't have to deal with that, but we do. There are a lot of lessons that we can bring in from the CPG area and other industries, such as marketing, branding, developing customer relationships, consumer education. We have a long way to go in that area. SOPs, particularly coming from manufacturing and supply chain, how to develop and refine those, as well as general business and staff management. Whether we're coming from the illicit cannabis industry or coming from other industries, there's practices that we can bring to what we're doing now, and there's practices that we can let go of that might not work in the legal cannabis market. Things like hearsay science or lack of traditional business skills from the illicit market, or people coming in from CPG who think that corporate experience is better than the lived experience of people in the illicit market. It's not better, it's just different. And so it's figuring out how we can work together. Eventually, hopefully in maybe decades, yes, cannabis, parts of it at least, will be like a CPG, but right now I'd say no, and we have a lot of work to do before that would happen.
Yeah, really good points there. I think it's sort of there's definitely some elements within CPG that I think like the cannabis industry can definitely take from. I think what really resonates with me with what you said is it's sort of like the marketing and branding side. I would argue that like that's already happened in cannabis in a lot of ways. I think we've taken a lot of those lessons. Where I think I'm with you as well is just we're not quite there yet in terms of like the standardization of the product. And I think kind of going back to what you said earlier, like the fact that it is an agricultural crop makes that very difficult. I'm someone who actually feels like I would actually welcome that. I understand sort of the challenges that are there, but I mean, if you can have sort of like a consistent product that is the same every time, like you buy a Bubba Kush from this particular brand, that it's going to be consistent in terms of like the flavor profile, the effects, whatever it might be. I don't know. I just feel like we're still sort of a long way from getting there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting the point that you bring up about the marketing and branding, particularly if people are coming from the illicit industry. That was never really, you'd be selling your pot to a middle person, and you're never really dealing with the end consumer. And the values that people were looking for then may not be the same as the values in the product that people are looking for now. It's really easy just to think about, oh, we grow the biggest buds. And how many people do you hear say, oh, ours is the best? well, that's not really a differentiating factor. And even, it's big to talk about people who are coming from the legacy industry now, but I don't feel that's a clear enough differentiating factor for the majority of the people who are going to be buying your product. It takes really getting into what your customer, and that could be a business or it could be an end use consumer, individual person. What is it that they are buying your product for? What is it that they're looking for? What problem are you solving for them? Because that's really what it's all about. It's not about, our company grows the biggest buds, ours look the best, we're the greatest. Well, but what is in it for the person who you're selling that product to? How are you satisfying what their needs are? How are you making their day better with the product that you're supplying?
Yeah, really like defining your target consumer and your target audience, right? And building that into the brand itself is definitely, super critical, right? So yeah, it'll be interesting. Like I think you make a good point. Like I think the whole sort of like legacy to legal has almost become its own branding and marketing in and of itself, which I think sometimes like really works out for companies. Like I know a few that are doing that really well, whereas others, like you said, it might not be enough, and there might need to be sort of more behind it, really, in terms of like defining that target consumer, defining really what it is that makes you unique. What is that differentiating factor compared to the rest? Because there's a lot of noise out there, right? It's a crowded market. So
a lot of misinformation and confusing messaging that's going out to people. And like I mentioned, the 70-year-old woman who I mentioned earlier, she doesn't necessarily care if you come from the legacy market. She cares about how she's going to feel going into the store, and she cares about if that's going to help her back feel better. The other parts don't matter. She just wants something that resonates with her and that fills her needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think it was a little bit maybe of a surprise when the cannabis sort of market first launched. I think a lot of people maybe felt as though, like you said, high quality cannabis, the biggest buzz, the most potent product. I mean, that is still the case. A lot of people do shop based off of, high THC. But still, I think a lot of people were sort of surprised that like legal cannabis attracted sort of like newcomers to cannabis just in general, not necessarily the sort of avid cannabis connoisseur, someone who's like a habitual user, right? Which, I think there's good and bad to that. Like, I think we're sort of maybe the legal market still might be struggling a little bit to attract that particular consumer. But I think personally, like they're doing really well at sort of bringing that new consumer in, right? So, I don't know how you feel, but that's sort of how I'm seeing the market right now. Like the legal market, particularly, it's sort of geared a little bit more towards sort of new consumers, people who aren't necessarily that interested in, necessarily like the highest quality product all the time, but are shopping a lot more based off, what we're hearing a lot about, which is THC percentage and also price, right? And again, I think there's good and bad to that, but like, there's still, time to improve, I guess.
Lots of time to improve.
Yeah.
And it's, and this is just part of being a new industry, right? It's this interesting scenario where it's a new industry, but it's also an old industry. What we're doing right now is new, and we're only a few years old, so we have a lot of maturing to do. We're very young as an industry. We have a lot to learn, and we're going to get more nuanced and, good at what we do as we grow.
Yeah, I think that's what's exciting. It's just like how much potential and sort of runway there still is, right?
I think that's why we're in this business, right? Because there's a lot of potential, and that's part of what helps us get through the times that are more challenging.
Yeah.
We can see something in the future. We know how good it can be.
Yeah.
And so that kind of keeps us going.
The light at the end of the tunnel a little bit. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
it might be very tiny right now, but
yeah, it's there. All right, well, switching gears here a little bit. So something I know that Phenologic is really focused on is sort of improving processes and operations. And so, cannabis, like we said, agricultural crop, there's a cycle to it that's repeated, 1 to 4 times a year. So what are some strategies that companies can utilize to refine those processes that help both the business and the staff?
I like that cannabis has this type of cycle. Everything really goes through cycles. We know that as people, we go through kind of predictable cycles as we, go through our lives. And plants, whenever you have these kinds of cycles that get repeated 1 to 4 times a year, each cycle is an opportunity for us to learn and to make improvements. And these improvements really, they boil down to how we can cut our costs, how we can improve the quality of what it is that we're doing, and how we can increase our profitability. So it's important to be open to and look for these opportunities. The success of all of our businesses really depends on this, making these continual improvements. Also good to remember is that our team is an excellent source of ideas to improve all of our systems. The best systems and procedures come from a group effort, and you can bet your employees have great ideas on how to make improvements. I'm going to share 5 steps around this, and I like to use a growing analogy since, we're talking about agriculture and plants. That's what we're doing. We're growing things. So the first step to think about is to create the environment that has your team comfortable with sharing their ideas. This is crucial. Too many people are afraid of rocking the boat. There's a power dynamic, even though sometimes as an employer or a boss, you might not necessarily understand that yourself, especially if you don't have a business background, but it's there. When you're the boss, oftentimes people are just going to tell you what they think you want to hear. That's not going to get you anywhere. So you need to create the environment that allows people to be comfortable sharing. You want to plant the seeds that get people thinking and motivated to improve, and really think about what is in it for your team to make improvements. Are they going to have a better workplace with less frustrations and maybe more pay? Or are they at risk of losing wages and hours due to efficiencies? There needs to be a payoff for everybody in order to make these improvements and have the improvements stick. The third thing is getting into the weeds. This is about what's really going on, not what you wish is happening. That's way too easy to do, to stick our head in the sand and pretend that things aren't going the way that they're going if we don't like it. This is a really good place to bring in outside eyes, bring in someone like myself who can help you to see your business more clearly. When you're in the middle of your business, you're busy. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's personal, and it's hard to see everything and be objective about the realities. The fourth piece is to prune. When you don't prune, if you grow cannabis, you know that you're going to wind up with a lot of substandard buds to deal with. Same with ideas. If you get too many ideas coming, it's hard to focus on what is really going to get the results that you want. So learn how to say no in a way that preserves your team's enthusiasm and your company's strategy. Just use, 1 to 2, maybe 3 changes at a time. You don't want to overwhelm people. You don't want to lose sight of what is actually making the improvements happen. And again, that's a good time to have an outside person come in to help you prioritize, help you see your blind spots. We can't see everything, and help you decide if your ideas are out to lunch or totally genius ideas. And the final step would be helping your improvements to bloom. You need to put them into action with a procedure that's followed and tracked to make sure that your changes are actually better. Not all changes are better. Sometimes you need to get rid of them. So you want to nurture your procedure the same way that you care for your plants and your flowers in your cannabis plants. And lastly, celebrate when you have a change that makes an improvement, that you get something dialed. wins, even small wins, help to strengthen your team. And we know in this industry, we need all the wins we can get.
Yeah, all really good points. Like, creating that open door policy, it can be really intimidating. Like, going up to your manager or, the boss and telling them, hey, this isn't working. And so you really need to have that open door policy and be receptive to that type of feedback. I like your point too about making sure that you're staying focused. There could be a lot of again, like noise coming at you in terms of like recommendations, changes, and that sort of thing, and then really putting it into action, right? And something that you have, a great resource that you have on Phenologic is your tips for writing great SOPs. And so within that, you mentioned, and that sort of like kind of ties back into like you said, actually putting this into action, making sure you're baking these into your operations, into your procedures. And so you mentioned sort of the importance of setting key performance indicators within sort of each SOP. So do you have any examples that you found that are sort of critical in terms of like key performance indicators that companies really should be, focused on in terms of like tracking and monitoring?
Really depends on the outcome that the company is looking for, which ultimately is about what your customers want, whether your customer is another business or an end use consumer. They are the people who are paying you to do what you're doing. So your KPIs all need to relate to, your customer's satisfaction in the end. It's easy to get bogged down in tracking too many KPIs, but that doesn't really serve your business. So just pick a few that relate to your strategy and what your customer cares about. So I have a few examples. One in particular that I find to be really interesting is how your strain or cultivar that you're growing and your pruning style relates to the plant growth and health and the work that comes after the harvest. To get into this a bit more, pruning affects the plant health and disease and the bud size. This also relates to your climate, which would be your HVAC systems, your lights, the plant growth habit, the look of the buds. Post-harvest, it affects your drying, your curing, and your trim time. Your bud size relates to the use of your flower, whether it's going to be sold as flower or whether it's going to be processed into a different type of product, and as well as your packaging. Big buds are more susceptible to disease, which could lead to crop loss. And then are you just ending up cutting down those big buds into smaller buds to fit into the package? So you really need to pay attention to all of those pieces. It all relates to the weight outcomes and your labor. Labor is high cost. So you want to make sure that you're keeping your labor costs under control. You may find that medium or smaller buds give you more weight and it might save time with your packaging. So don't get sucked into something that you think that you need to do if it doesn't serve your business goals or the use of your product or what your customers want in the end. Another one that is kind of a lesson learned from warehousing and manufacturing is the time of the procedures in terms of the steps. And I'm talking actual walking steps. Every step that you take is time, and time is money. So things like, are your supplies where they are needed, or do your staff need to walk back and forth to get them? Are they wandering around trying to find somebody to answer a question? If your facility isn't organized and efficient, if it's not optimized, you're going to be losing money and your staff are going to be frustrated. So you can fit these into your KPIs and think about, how long is this procedure actually taking? Is there a way that we can reduce the amount of time that this procedure takes? And we can track a KPI around that to make sure that we're being most effective. And then finally, for something for business leaders to think about is how much time you can track time for a KPI as far as how much operating procedure frees up time for you. You want to take yourself out of your daily task doing and move more into leader guiding the business role. Of all the things that need to be done in your business as a company leader, it's critical that you have time to lead and to steer your ship. So that's another interesting KPI you can look at, how much time an SOP is actually freeing you up to run your business.
Focus on strategy, right? As opposed to sort of the minutia of the day to day.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really really good advice there. And then I think too, we mentioned sort of that transition from people from the legacy market into the legal market. I think one of the most daunting things is SOPs at the end of the day, because Health Canada requires them. You really have to have SOPs for pretty much every single task that you're doing within the facility. So what are some of like the critical mistakes that you see happening when it comes to, creating those SOPs, building them out, and refining them as time goes on? Is there sort of some common problems, common mistakes that you're seeing being made pretty consistently?
Yes, think about your SOPs as a tool, and they can be quite liberating. If you have an SOP, it really frees you up to be able to do other things. Three things that really stand out to me are that SOPs are often overly complicated or restrictive. Health Canada wants to see if it's in an SOP, it needs to be done. And if it's not, it's a potential compliance infraction. So have the SOP reflect the actual work without having so much detail that staff are bogged down in the minutia, like you say. You can start your SOP tight, but then loosen it up, make it easier to follow. Have a system for improvements though. Don't just keep on recording deviations. That's another time suck. So actually have a system to continually improve your SOPs. Another issue can be that SOPs, particularly if they're pre-made, may not fit your facility. They may just be too generic and not reflect your specific operations or setup. They're a good base, but again, you need to adjust them to make sure they meet your needs. And lastly, SOPs that people don't want to do. There could be multiple reasons for this. One particularly big issue to pay attention to is when leaders don't follow their own SOPs. This shows the team that the SOPs aren't important. If the boss doesn't do this, why should I do this? The boss doesn't seem to think it's important. That is going to filter out into other serious and costly business issues relating to workplace culture. If they're too onerous or if they don't make sense, people also are going to not want to do them. So just make sure that they're easy to do and logical, and fix them to make sure that they are.
Yeah, sort of lead by example, right? And the second you, not to use the word deviation, but the second you deviate from that, right, it can cause some problems. But I like your first point too. It's like, I think a lot of people think about SOPs being this like strict, regimented, sort of, this is step one, this is step two, this is step three, but you can sort of kind of dig yourself into a bit of a hole by doing that. And so, like you said, it might be something where at first it's very specific, but it doesn't necessarily hurt to maybe sort of expand that a little bit so that you aren't recording a deviation every single time, an extra leaf is pruned or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah. And we want to make sure, that, like I say, they're tools to help us do our jobs. And when the workflow breaks down, it's usually the process, it's not the person. So just make sure that your SOPs fit your people and they fit your plants. So then it can all work together harmoniously.
Yeah, I love that. So in terms of like verification, so you say as well in that resource that you provide through Phenologic in terms of like building verification right into the SOP. So what do you mean by that, and sort of how does that help in terms of preventing those critical mistakes that we might see?
I'm going to give you an example from the previous business that I had and a couple tips around verification. So really, you don't want any mistakes to leave your facility. Any mistake that leaves a facility is far more expensive and is damaging to your reputation than it is to deal with it before it leaves your facility. My previous business was a retail delivery service, and we had a critical control point before our driver left. It was crucial that he had or she had everything in their truck. So we had a check to make sure all the packing slips were printed, a check to make sure all the orders were packed, a check to make sure they were all packed correctly, a check to make sure they were all loaded, and a final verification to make sure that all of that stuff was signed off on. We never relied on verbal communication. Everything was signed off. It only took a few seconds, but it gave us a paper trail. So if something did go wrong, we could fix it. And we built all of those steps because we'd had mistakes leave our facility, and they cost us money and they cost us our reputation. So we put all those steps into place. A few tips around that are your attitude towards verification. Make sure everybody understands why things need to be verified, that they understand that it leads to costly mistakes, it leads to disappointed customers, more stress, and then it leads to all of us feeling like we're not doing a good job. So don't skip these verification points. And you can add, like you mentioned, they can be, the SOPs don't need to be so stuffy as we think that they need to be. We actually had in one of our SOPs that you give the driver a high five. It's minor, but it adds some enjoyment, and it was an idea from one of our staff. And so it's just, incorporating those little bits that give people ownership and have a little fun in your day too. As well, with the SOPs, a part of the verification is making sure that we support each other. It's not a personal thing. We're following a procedure. So we all want to do well as a team. Let's work together to do that and help each other out so that we all can do a good job together.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, building some fun into it. That's awesome. And, I think that's so important, like having multiple verification steps, might seem a little bit tedious, but it can definitely be worthwhile. Like you said, the second it leaves the facility, you're putting a lot at risk there. And I think, probably the biggest recall I would say that happens in the cannabis industry right now is just inverse THC and CBD labeling, right? A lot of companies like accidentally putting the CBD numbers as the THC numbers and the THC numbers as the CBD. I'm pretty sure that's sort of like the most common reason for a recall. And that's like a very, very minor thing and like a really small mistake, but can really be a costly sort of process, right, for making that mistake. So
yeah, recalling a product, changing labels, that is really expensive.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do that, and then it doesn't make your company look good either. You go to Reddit and people will post stuff about this, about bad labeling or about an empty container or just, some type of dissatisfaction. And you really don't want that stuff to leave the facility. So even though it feels onerous at the time, it's way less onerous than having to do a recall or public relations damage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, well, just finally, I wanted to touch on, so we mentioned at the start, kind of sort of coming full circle here, but, it's still a relatively new industry, cannabis, even in Canada. Like you said, it's sort of like an old industry, but a new industry. It's sort of in that weird gray zone, not to use a term that's, commonly associated with cannabis as well. But, I think they're especially initially, right? We saw a lot of sort of pushback on the fact that a lot of people being brought into cannabis didn't necessarily come from the cannabis industry. I actually think like that has come a long way since legalization. Like you're hearing more and more about legacy players entering the market. So what do you think, just sort of on that point, like, what do you think legacy market players can teach those with a more traditional background? Like you mentioned at the start, a lot of people are coming from, regulatory affairs, quality assurance, the pharmaceutical industry, food, alcohol, beverage, all of that. Like, what really is it that you think that side of the industry can learn from the legacy operators?
We've been talking about cannabis as being a plant, and so I would suggest to people just be open to cannabis as a plant. We have a lot to learn from plants and nature, how everything is interconnected in a web. There's plenty of examples of how when we don't remember that interconnection to our environment, things go sideways. We can't force nature to do things. We can't really force living things to do things. We like to think we can, but plants are going to plant. So just remember that we're dealing with a plant. Another piece is to understand that you don't operate an illicit business for a long time without a lot of determination, motivation, and resourcefulness. People coming from the illicit industry have that in order for them to continue to succeed. And a few other pieces are, don't front. It's okay that you don't know a lot about cannabis. Don't pretend that you do. People can tell. And don't act like your corporate experience is better. Like I say, it's just different. So come in with an open mind, ask questions, and learn. Realize that trust takes time. People are not going to necessarily be upfront with you right away or open and sharing when they're coming from the illicit industry. A lot of people have been burned in the past and they're very protective about what they do. So have some patience around that and realize that there's a lot of people that are going through a big adjustment. They've maybe had their lives drastically changed. Some people have lost the ability to do what they love, or that is a big part of who they are. So have patience with that part and respect non-traditional business abilities. Operating an unregulated business in the past, some have been well run and some maybe have not been well run. But it does take some talent to continue to run an underground business for decades. Prohibition era cannabis people, like I say, are very determined and resourceful. And those are the types of qualities that we need right now for our industry to flourish. We're going through growing pains. We're going to continue to go through some growing pains. It's a normal process. It's normal part of business cycles. Some businesses are going to survive and some aren't going to survive. But I really believe that bringing in the best from traditional corporate business and the best from underground cultures is going to create a progressive company that will do good things. And those are the types of companies that are going to survive. So just come in with a spirit of collaboration and success, and I think that you'll do well.
Perfect. Yeah. Come with an open mind, right? Be ready to sort of learn from that side of things. And like you said, I think I think some people sort of look at cannabis and they're like, it's like any other crop. And then you have sort of the legacy players that are like, no, it's very unique. There is sort of nuance in the details and nuance to the cultivation process and, giving attention to each and every plant and that sort of thing, which, some people might view that as, a bit, unfounded or unscientific or whatever it might be, right? Like however sort of they judge that feeling. But I think there's definitely something to that. I think there is a clear sort of distinction between maybe like industrial grown cannabis compared to, something that there is a bit more focus on attention and detail, right? And yeah, and I think like that's what I think legacy players bring a lot to the table in regards to that, right? They have that different perspective. They understand that it does take that sort of like tender love and care, right? Which again might sound a little bit, outside of the box or like unscientific, but I think sort of the proof is in the pudding there. Like when you see sort of like the product that is made from a facility that does have that attention to detail, like there's a big difference, right? It's noticeable.
And those smaller scale, the craft operators, I'm doing this because we don't really have a definition for craft yet. So that'll come as our industry matures. We'll have a more clear definition about what craft is. But, the companies that are really hands-on and really the hands touching and really getting to know, closely what it is, tracking their plants and really having that close relationship with what's going on there. Yeah, those are the companies that I am most interested in connecting with. And yeah, I really like what's happening there, and just the respect that people have for plants and nature and people, and we can all come together and create something really positive and progressive.
Exactly. Important message there for sure. So in terms of like you mentioned it there, the companies that you want to connect with, how do people get in touch with you? What is the best way to get a hold of you? Like I was saying earlier, Phenologic has some really great resources there. I know you do a lot of great work. So yeah, how do people get in touch with you, Velvet?
Well, there's a few different places that people can reach me on social media. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. My name is Velvet Kavanagh, spelled with a K. I think it'll probably have my full name, so people will be able to find me that way. My company, Phenologic, they can look me up on LinkedIn that way as well. I'd love for people to reach out and connect with me. And if you do so, then please do mention that you saw this conversation that we had today. I'd like to know who's been watching. As well, I'm on Instagram, Phenologic again, and on Reddit. You can check out my website, phenologic.ca, and my email as well, velvet@phenologic.ca. I really enjoy meeting with people in the cannabis industry, finding out what they're up to and what's exciting for them in cannabis. So please do feel free to reach out to me and have a conversation.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll link that down below, and highly recommend. And a little shout out to you. Always do have some alongside a lot of the great insight that you share, including a lot of great reviews. So I'm always checking out the reviews that you have, the different beverages that you're checking out and sampling. So that's always great as well. So definitely check out Velvet. Lots of great information there, and a really great resource as well.
Oh, thanks for those words, Connor.
Absolutely. Well, Velvet, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great connection and conversation.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun as well. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of High Fidelity. For access to the entire Cannabis 360 catalog, subscribe at canna360.ca or visit our YouTube channel, Canna360.